Good morning student, I am your bio teacher and in this video we will see pollination. In the previous video already we have studied about that structure of flower, parts of flower and the male gametes, female gametes. Already we have studied in the previous video. So you know that what is the anther and what is the stigma, style and ovary. Anther is the male anther which contain the pollen grain, and pollen grain is the male gametes, and in the ovary contain the ovules. Ovules is a female gametes. So everybody you know that what is mean by anther, what is mean by pollen grain and what is mean by ovules. Got it? In this video we will see detailed study about that, the pollination. Pollination is the process in which pollen grain from anther are transferred to the stigma of the flower of the same species. Is called as pollination. Pollination means what? It is a process in which pollen grain is a transfer from anther to the stigma in same flower, otherwise in different flower. This process is called as the pollination. There are two types of the pollination: self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination, in this process the anther, the pollen grain from the anther to transfer the stigma in same flower. This is called as the self-pollination. And the cross-pollination, the pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of one flower to the another flower. This is called as the cross-pollination. With the help of diagram we will see. This is a bisexual flower. In the previous video, I will explain you what is meant by bisexual and what is meant by unisexual. Bisexual means the flower which contain both anther and stigma. Anther, which contain the pollen grain, is a male gamete which is transferred from anther to the stigma in same flower. The anther are transferred to the stigma itself. This is called as a self-pollination. The pollen grain from anther to the stigma of the another flower in same plant, and the pollen grain transferred to the stigma by itself. This is called as a self-pollination. Means there is no external agent is required for transfer the pollen grain from anther to the stigma. This process is called as the self-pollination. Got it everybody? What is mean by self-pollination? And the cross-pollination means it is a unisexual flower, means the male flower is present on another plant and female flower is another plant. It is the anther which contain the pollen grain. The pollen grain are transferred from the one flower to the stigma of another flower of another plant but in same species. This is called as the cross-pollination. Got it everybody? What is meant by self-pollination and cross-pollination? Self-pollination, the process is carried out in the bisexual flower, otherwise in the same plant, and the anther, pollen grain and ovules are mature in the same time. This condition, the self-pollination is carried out. And the cross-pollination, in the cross-pollination some agents are required, because why? The anther and stigma is a non-motile. Means non-motile means you know the anther are not able to move from one place to another place. This is called non-motile. Then how does it transfer from anther to the stigma? With the help of some external agent. In the cross-pollination, the pollen grain is a transfer from anther to the stigma. It's called as a cross-pollination. There are three agents is required for a cross-pollination: insect, wind and water. We will see what is. With the help of insect, the pollen grain is a transfer from anther to the stigma. This is called as the insect pollination. Then some characteristics which is required to the flower. That's why the insect is attracted towards the flowers, and when the insect is sit on the flower, that times some pollen grains are stick their body, and in that way the insect are transferred the pollen grain from anther to the stigma. The flower is colorful, large in size, The flower is very colorful. Then insect is attracted towards the flower. Second characteristics, these are scented. The flower have a smell. Scented. That's why the insect is attracted towards the flower by the smell, and in that way the pollen grain is a transfer from anther to the stigma. The pollen grain have very sticky, because when the insect sit on the flower, that time the pollen grain stick to the body of the insect, and the flower is contain nectar. Because of nectar, the insect is come towards the flower to suck the nectar. When the insect suck the nectar, that times the pollen grain is stick to the flower's insect body, and when the insect are sit on the another flower of same species, in that way they can transfer the pollen grain from anther to the stigma. Got it, everybody? What is mean the insect pollination, and what characteristics is required for the flower for the insect pollination? Colorful petals, the scent, the way good smell of the flower contain nectar, and the pollen grains are sticky. The first characteristics is required to the flower. That's why the insect is attracted to the flower, and the insect are carried out the process of cross pollination. Next agent is the wind. With the help of wind, the pollen grain is transferred from anther to the stigma. This is called the wind pollination. In the wind pollination, so it is also some characteristics is required to the flower for the wind pollination. The pollen grain is very small. The flower is a dull in color because it is not required to attract the insect. The flower is a dull in color. The pollen grain is very small, because why? They can blow off easily in the wind. The pollen grains are produced large quantity, because in the winds most of the pollen grains are wasted. So the pollen grain is produced in very large quantity. Some few pollen grains are transferred from anther to the stigma, and most of the pollen grains are wasted everywhere. That's why the flowers are produced the large quantity of the pollen grain, and pollen grain is not sticky. Pollen grains are dry and lightweight, easily blow off in the wind. Got it, everybody? What is meant by wind pollination? With the help of wind, the pollen grain are transferred from anther to the stigma of two different plant, but in same species. This is called as the wind pollination. And next agent is the water. Water is also, with the help of water, the pollen grain are transferred from anther to the stigma. This is called as the water pollination. In our textbook have given a good example of Vallisneria. Vallisneria is a two types of the plant, male plant and female plant. The male plant are grow in the bottom of the water bodies, and the flowers are grow in bottom of the water bodies, and in the female plants are grow up, the flowers of the female plant are floating over the water. In this plant, when the male plant is mature, which is detached from the plant and floating over the water, and both when the female plants are floating over the water, the male plants are transfer the pollen grain from anther to the stigma of the female plant. In that way, the water pollination process is carried out. And in the water pollination process also required some characteristics of the flower. The pollen grain and the flowers are very small and lightweight. Why? Because easily floating over the water, and the male and female flowers are born on the separate plant. That's why the water pollination. And the pollen grains are also produced in the large quantity. Why it is large quantity? Because most of the pollen grains are floating over the waters and most are wasted. Few pollen grains are transferred from the female stigma. Got it, everybody? What is meant by cross pollination? Cross pollination means in the two different flower, two different plant are transferred from the pollen grain from anther to the stigma with the help of some agent like insect, wind and water. This pollination is cross pollination. Got it, everybody? What is mean by pollination? There are two types of the pollination: self pollination, cross pollination. Self pollination process is carried out in the bisexual flower. Bisexual means both gametes is present in the single flower and both are mature on the same time. This flower is a self pollinated. Self pollinated means the anther is a transfer from pollen grain is a transfer from anther to the stigma by itself. There is no required for external agent. And in the cross pollination, with the help of some external agent, the pollen grain is a transfer from anther to the stigma. This is called as a cross pollination. In my next video, I will explain about that, what is meant by the fertilization and how does the seed fruits are produced. Next important points in the pollination: artificial pollination. Artificial pollination means what? In this process, artificially we can transfer the pollen grain from anther to the stigma. This is called as the artificial pollination. In this way, in this process, we can artificially transfer the pollen grain from anther to the stigma, two different species, and there is so many variation in this plant. Got it, everybody? What is mean by artificial? Artificially we can transfer the pollen grain from anther to the stigma. This is called as a artificial pollination. Thank you.